Alright guys, today we are going to be covering the topic of welding. I'm sure many of you have heard the term before. It's a common word, if you will, used in construction and other things like that, but also for arts and crafts and sticking things together. Now the official definition of welding is a fabrication process that joins materials, usually metals or thermoplastics, by causing a molten puddle or melted puddle. Some of the most early kinds of welding were actually whenever metals were first discovered, like during the Bronze Age. The very first kind of welding was actually pot welding. So this was done by collecting rocks that contained copper or bronze in them and smelting them down into a ceramic pot and creating a pot metal and scraping the slag off of the top. Slag it's like a glassy substance or like a rock. It bonds to the impurities in the metal and floats them to the top and allows them to be scraped or chipped off. That was the very first kind of welding. The second kind of welding that was discovered was actually discovered by a self-proclaimed chemist. He was self-taught, and it was in 1800 actually. His name was Sir Humphrey David. He specialized in creating electrodes, which are rods that contain different elements within the metals, with different metals, and whenever an electric arc is ran through them, they melt and create different colors. So his specialty was in creating multicolored electrodes. I don't know why that was popular at the time, but it was. And in doing this, he actually discovered what is most commonly known as arc welding in today's society. Arc welding is extremely important and has gone through many innovations and growths over time. Now you're probably thinking, why is welding so important? Take a look around you. What is the chair you're sitting on made out of? Is it made out of metal? I'll bet you it was welded together at some point in time. What about your car that you got to school with today? Or the school bus? Or your bed frame? Or any other thing that has metal, I'm sure has been welded at some point in time. In fact, I know it has, because it has to be welded to put it into whatever form it's in right now, like a pipe. Now there are three main types of welding that we see in today's society. The first kind, most commonly used, is actually called MIG, or GMAW, gas metal arc welding. And how this works is there is a roll of wire that is ran through a machine at different voltages and wire feed speeds, and a wire shoots out the end of a gun, and when it touches the base metal, it creates an arc, and that arc melts the steel together, along with adding metal. That way you have a filler metal. The second kind is TIG, or GTAW, gas tungsten arc welding, and this is used by having a torch in one hand with a piece of tungsten, the electrode. It's a non-consumable, so it means it does not melt like the MIG wire does. The arc is very stable, and you feed wire in by hand. The third kind of welding is one of the earliest kinds of welding. It's called stick welding, or SMAW. This is used by having an electrode holder, which is basically a clamp with a metal rod coated in flux, which creates slag, like I mentioned earlier, when melted. This is done by sticking it in the electrode holder and striking it, and then just welding with that rod. This is probably the most important kind of welding in our society today, because it is used to get you all of your natural gas, all of your oil, all of your water, and many other things that need to travel across country, because stick welding is very portable. In fact, many guys put them on the back of trucks. That's how portable they are. Stick welding was developed in the early 1920s and evolved into something far greater. Before they were using bare metal electrodes, these electrodes were not coated in anything. The coating on this electrode is called a flux. And the reason people decided they needed to have a flux was because whenever they would weld, they would get these things, impurities and porosity, which basically looks like Swiss cheese. A bunch of bubbles grew out of it because it produces gases. The reason people decided they needed to have a flux on the electrode was because of porosity, which looks like Swiss cheese inside your weld, and that is not a good sign. The very first flux that was used on a steel wire was actually a piece of wet newspaper. wrapped around the electrode. And the reason this was used was because of the gas that the smoke produced. So that whenever you burn something, it releases CO2. And CO2 is a gas that stabilizes the arc and protects it from outside gases such as oxygen and nitrogen, which can contaminate welds and cause porosity. And from there, it just grew. People like stick welding. It replaced things such as rivets, and it was just a very nice setup because rivets took forever and welding was fast compared to what they were doing before. They were able to build bigger, better structures that would last longer and were stronger. This completely changed the industry of construction and the industrial age. This further grew during wars such as World War I and World War II, and also in Vietnam, where airplanes and tanks and other weapons and ships were essential to our military and our soldiers because it was stronger than bolts and rivets, and also it was watertight because it literally melted the things together. And so it was a better system all around for the military, and also commercial use. Everybody needed welders. They needed them to put up fences. They needed them, to keep in cattle. They needed welders to weld car frames together or to do repair jobs on a tank of some kind, or anything. Welding literally could be used for anything, considering how versatile it is. Another kind of welding is forge welding. This is most commonly used among blacksmiths, and like in the later 1800s, whenever people were creating wagon wheels for carts, like the Amish people nowadays, you see their carts inside the road. Their wheels have a steel band wrapped around the wooden tire that they forge weld together by heating up to around 1500 to 2000 degrees Fahrenheit and hammering together, because that's when it becomes like a jelly state and it just sticks together really nice. Very dramatic, lots of sparks. In fact, you can probably see that up there. We still do that today. Most commonly we see it in pocket knives and things like that. It's called Damascus steel. You see the knives with all the different fancy patterns on them, and like different light and darks in it and all that. Those are pretty cool. They're very expensive knives too. Oxy-fuel welding is where you have a torch that is literally shooting fire at the end, and it's burning oxygen and acetylene. And this produces a flame around 6,000 degrees, 6,000 to 7,000 degrees, and can literally melt the steel together, and you feed rod in like you would TIG wire. They would use oxy fuel torches actually back in the day whenever they were using rivets to build towers, and like the Eiffel Tower was completely built using rivets and oxy fuel torches. So now that we're basically moved past the history of welding, I'd like to get into some of the job opportunities available, especially in the Springfield area. Welding is actually a dying trade because many of the welders that we have in shops today were introduced in their early 20s to welding right after the Vietnam War, whenever a bunch of young men came home from war, and it was a good job at the time. And so many of our welders that are in the workforce currently are actually retiring, and they're looking for people who can replace them, and there are companies out there willing to pay big bucks and many good benefits as well. Many companies will match your 401k up to 40%. That's pretty dang good, considering a lot of other places around here that just do construction only match it up to 8%. So keep that in mind. So Springfield, Missouri actually produces the most stainless steel out of any other city in the world. That means lots of money. Many of the shops around town will pay starting wages at around $25 an hour if you can learn how to do stainless steel TIG welding. This is very good because you have an opportunity to make a lot of money and get home with your family every night and be home on the weekends. Very good gig. Another opportunity is pipe welding. That you're generally gone for 2 to 8 months at a time, but you make around $400,000 a year. So either you stay in town and make $52,000 a year, or you go make a lot more money on the road. Another kind of welding is robotic welding, extremely popular right now as a lot of kids are getting into video games, and it's very similar to video games. In fact, robotic welding, they actually have controllers like Xbox controllers, and you get to use a robot to weld, which is pretty cool. A lot of these machines bolt to pipes and other sorts of jigs. A jig is something that holds the part in place. And it has a little screen on it, and you can see what the puddle's doing, the molten weld puddle, and you can maneuver the torch or whatever it is you're welding with all robotically, and you don't actually have to be there to weld. In fact, a lot of people weld from across the world. So a lot of companies that are doing pipeline or something and they have a portable robotic welder, they can actually be at the office welding via wireless transmitting. It's pretty cool. It's pretty popular right now. It's a new technology that is just in its baby stages, and there's a lot of potential for it. That also means they're looking for people who can program these machines to do what the controls say and design these machines, and that pays a lot of money. Robotic welders, or just to develop a robotic welder, the robotic welder itself costs $10,000 to $14,000 for a cheap one. So just think about that. If you want to learn more about welding, just hook up with me after class or something. I can inform you a lot about it because I've been going to school for it for 2 years now. Thanks for watching.